Why do political parties exist? Is it to stand for something, to represent a segment of society that requires representation, or is it to enter government? Well, ideally it's both, but rarely is this possible. Instead, compromises must be made and parties must tread a fine line between becoming solely ideological and solely power-hungry empty shells. Sometimes both of these ends aren't contradictory though. To speak of a politics without a left or a right, to speak of a politics that cuts through taken for granted political chasms, can and has been successful. We need only look at Emmanuel Macron's rise in France to see the allure. Sometimes presentation trumps politics, which means parties must minimise their reliance on wedge issues and rush to the centre to appeal to the broadest political base possible. This may be a good short-term strategy in terms of vote seeking, but the inevitable growing disaffection of an electoral base can hugely disrupt the electoral system and provide openings for other contenders, both from within and without the party. This is essentially the story of the Labour Party and the ascension of Jeremy Corbyn. It's 1997 and times are changing in the UK. The Conservative Party are floundering after dominating UK politics. Tony Blair has reinvigorated the once considered stagnant Labour Party, and The Sun has jumped ship, urging readers on its front page, "The Sun backs Blair." Tony Blair won the 1997 election with 43% of the vote. Tony Blair can best be described as a blank political slate. Although he infamously wrote in a letter to Michael Foot, "I came to socialism through Marxism," there is very little evidence of this anywhere in his political behaviour. If anything, Blair's foremost inspirations seem to be in right-wing neoliberal figures of the time. George Bush, Sarkozy, Berlusconi, heck, even Rupert Murdoch. For Blair, emphasis was to be placed on free enterprise and meritocracy, coupled with a soft left-wing agenda of social justice. As he stated prior to his electoral victory in 1997, "I want a society based on meritocracy, and one in which your sexuality, gender and race are not important." All very well, but this also implied a massive reorientation of what the Labour Party meant. Up until this point, Labour had always been strongly bound to the unions, but Tony wanted to loosen this bond, and instead build up a strong constituency of supporters he could depend on. He remarked, "Virtually all my adult life, the Labour Party has been a very narrow coalition. We were defined by reference to trade unions, the public sector, and not much else. I have tried to build a Labour Party based on values, and it is really up to other people to decide whether they share these values or not." In the end, this would happen and people would seemingly share his values. Come 1997, Labour membership had ballooned to 420,000. About 2/3 of the newly recruited members came from salaried and professional backgrounds, and only 13% of Labour MPs came from a background in manual occupations, a historic shift in demographics. I've already mentioned the media endorsement by The Sun, but this wasn't an isolated or coincidental appraisal, rather a coordinated effort on behalf of Blair to ingratiate himself with the right-wing press. In 1995, he travelled to Australia at the invitation of Rupert Murdoch to speak at a News International conference, and even wrote for The Sun on crime, which would later become a central policy point for New Labour. The Sun, who had strongly backed Thatcher, had little to fear in supporting Blair, as he himself claimed to be a great admirer of the Iron Lady and pledged he would not reverse her main policies. Indeed, 3 weeks after taking office, he held a secret meeting with Thatcher for advice on a number of issues. There certainly is continuity here. Already by 1995 had Labour rewritten the infamous Clause 4 of the party's constitution, which stressed the nationalisation of industry. Labour was, in effect, dropping its key issues and becoming something different entirely. And come 1996, a contingent had split to form the Socialist Labour Party. This led to a diversification of the political landscape. The Conservative vote remained pretty much static from 1997 until 2010, which aided the Labour Party, who were able to hijack their traditional issues of free market economy and crime. Not only that, but the Tories missed a pivotal opportunity with the Iraq War in 2003. Had they opposed the move and the futile hunt for weapons of mass destruction, they could have positioned themselves as opposition. Instead, they obsequiously blundered, and the public literally had no viable alternative for government. Labour between 1997 and 2001 lost 3 million votes. mostly from the country's poorest areas, but thanks to a stagnant Tory party, it little mattered. However, these affected millions didn't simply abstain, not solely anyway. Many voted for other parties. The two benefactors of this were the Liberal Democrats and the SNP. At the 2005 general election, the Liberal Democrats had made major inroads into London, Manchester, Sheffield, Edinburgh, and other urban centres, representing a sudden shift in the political landscape, unseen for almost a century. The SNP were able to balloon thanks to the formation of a Scottish Parliament, a key election pledge of the 1997 election, which elected members under a proportional representation system, unlike Westminster, and thus increased the visibility of the third and fourth parties markedly. The SNP shifted leftward, which put immense pressure on Labour, who in turn rejected core New Labour tenets in Scotland to fight off the oncoming SNP. As for the Tories in Scotland, well, they'd been non-existent since 1997, when they lost every single Scottish seat they held. The third Labour victory in 2005 was hardly an achievement. The vote was a low one, a very low one. Party membership was almost half of what it was in 1997. Blair had already pledged to step down from leadership and not seek re-election for a fourth term. By 2006, Labour's poll ratings were lower than they had been since 1992, and Tony Blair continued voicing opinions way out of whack with public consensus, such as siding with Israel over attacks on Lebanon, which resulted in party infighting and criticism from fellow Labour MPs. In 2007, Gordon Brown became Prime Minister, much to the chagrin of Blairites, who oversaw a financial collapse and the growth of the Conservatives under David Cameron, who took his party leftward and attempted to outflank the left on social issues such as immigration and marriage equality. By 2010, the Tories and Lib Dems had formed a coalition government, something that hadn't occurred since 1940. This was mostly due to the increasingly fractured political landscape, contributed to by Labour's alienation of vast swathes of the electorate. Then came the Labour leadership election, which saw the rise of Ed Miliband. Ed won, but barely, with less than a percentage point between he and his brother David. David had the backing of the parliamentary wing of the party and was more in line with Blairite orthodoxy, whereas Ed represented a leftward drift away from New Labour, but also an attempt to bring home some working class votes that had been lost to the nationalism of the BNP, the EDL and UKIP, which had done much to reshape the public debate on immigration. Notoriously in 2010, Gordon Brown had called a Labour supporter, calling him out on issues of immigration and the economy, a bigoted woman, surreptitiously picked up by a Sky News microphone. This did well to sediment the perceived divide between those in the parliamentary wing of the party and real working class people, a divide that Miliband worked hard to overturn. Indeed, Emily Thornberry was pressured to resign after tweeting an image in 2015 of a semi-detached house in Rochester draped in St George's Cross flags. The image was seen as a condescending jab at working class patriotism, to which Miliband was reportedly furious as it undermined much of his posturing throughout his 2015 campaign. Scottish nationalism also came a-biting. Cameron had pledged a referendum on independence for 2014. The Tories, not too popular in Scotland, did little campaigning for the no vote in the referendum, and so it was up to Labour. The SNP, the largest presence in the Scottish Parliament, had been able to maintain their principles in Scotland, such as with free education, much better than Labour had been to protect them in England. If anything, the SNP seemed more competent. The 2015 election saw another Labour defeat, even though they did increase their vote by a tad, 1.5%. The take-home message was the decimation of the Liberal Democrats by the Tories, an intentional Conservative strategy, and the further rise of the SNP in the wake of Labour's disastrous result in Scotland. The SNP won 56 of 59 seats. So now, not only were the Tories practically non-existent in Scotland, but Labour weren't either. This is the context in which Jeremy Corbyn rose to prominence. Many decried Labour's defeat in 2015 as a symptom of Labour becoming too left-wing, but Labour had been in steady decline since 2001, mostly kept buoyant by a Conservative Party beside them struggling to stay afloat. Labour was formerly conceived of as a loose confederation of the labour movement with the trade unions at its core. However, New Labour had ultimately alienated this base, and Blair and his followers had worked tirelessly to free Labour of the unions and instead build a solid contingent of members to depend on, less pushy and more easily manageable. In other words, union money would be less necessary if there was a passive legion of hundreds of thousands paying a small yearly fee that wouldn't question the authority of the professional parliamentary wing of the party. This logic eventually culminated in the £3 fee that granted people the right to vote in the 2015 leadership election, with disastrous results for the Blairites. Over 300,000 people registered their support for the party, accusations of entryism ran rampant, and many urged then leader Harriet Harman to cancel the election. In the end, Corbyn won thanks to a revitalised membership who envisaged a radically different future for the party from the neoliberalism of the parliamentary Blairites. We often hear Corbyn framed as a throwback, as if he is a rejuvenation of an old-school socialist tendency within Labour, somewhat similar to Michael Foot, who led the party in the early 1980s. Maybe that's not entirely misplaced, but it does utterly ignore the factors that put him into leadership. Corbyn is a modern phenomenon, a phenomenon of his time. Were it not for the mass mobilisation of new members through social media and the various protest movements that sprung up around 2010 throughout the country, Corbyn would be little heard of. Indeed, social media was largely credited as the chief mobilising factor about the 2015 leadership elections. Perhaps this contextualises better what John McDonnell meant when he dubbed Labour socialism with an iPad. One campaign organiser for Corbyn relates, "There is a lot of exaggeration about social media, but we went from nothing to reaching 2.5 million people within 4 weeks of our Facebook page being launched. At the moment, our page reaches 11 million people every day. In Colchester, this meant that when we put the announcement out about our meeting on Facebook, all 1,000 tickets were gone within 45 minutes. This was before the polls showed Corbyn leading the other candidates." It can't be denied that success for Labour since Corbyn has been lacklustre. But how could it have been any other way given the situation he inherited? Moreover, what is the evidence that moving back to the centre would benefit Labour, who were already plunged into historic lows? A second leadership contest for Labour control was held in 2016, after 172 members of Parliament took a vote of no confidence in Corbyn. But Corbyn sailed through this again as party members rallied to his support. Now we have another threat from the parliamentary wing of the party, as 100 MPs are threatening to break away from the party in the case of a Tory landslide result. Again, this has happened before. In the 1980s, party moderates left the party in response to Foot's leftward direction. The Social Democratic Party was formed and aimed to rally the party's middle-class supporters, but all this did was guarantee a Margaret Thatcher victory, and the SDP in the end had to merge with the Liberals, now the Liberal Democrats, to gain any semblance of viability. A breakaway of Blairites would do little but the same. The real trouble with Labour is that they cannot appease their dual base of working-class manual workers and middle-class metropolitans in an environment that is increasingly divided. The rise of UKIP was a disaster for Labour, as many ditched the party to rally for Brexit. The collapse of UKIP has been a disaster for Labour also, as these former Labour voters, largely from the working classes, have migrated to the Tories, who under May are promising strong Brexit negotiations. Conversely, the resuscitated Liberal Democrats are attempting to mop up metropolitan support by standing in opposition to Brexit. This means Labour can't say anything definitive on Brexit without alienating a necessary core of their supporters, and with Brexit playing on the minds of the majority throughout this election, this is a big problem. In Scotland, the contenders are the Tories and the SNP. The SNP, oddly, were able to flourish thanks to an increasingly left-wing position in the face of Labour's rightward turn. The point is, the malaise facing Labour is less to do with Corbyn than it is to do with trends that were taking place since the birth of New Labour. New Labour's appeal to both left and right, but in the end alienating everybody, has ultimately divided the political landscape. Compound this with Brexit, in which the nation is divided into an almost 50-50 split, and the Remain-oriented left, regardless of how they present themselves, have a problem. UKIP have collapsed and the right are united. Labour, on the other hand, are divided within and without in the form of the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, the SNP, all reaching increasing levels of success. This election will see a Tory victory, likely by a considerable margin. Corbyn has said he would not step down were this the case. The question, I guess, is one of degree. All Corbyn need do in this election is sustain Labour seats. One of the odd quirks of British politics is how little total percentages matter. Instead, winning constituencies is where the importance lies. It seems unlikely that Labour will see a disaster as acute as that of 2015 in Scotland, but we'll see. And whether they do will largely predict the party's future. Thanks a lot for watching this video. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you didn't, hey, click dislike and leave a comment and tell me why not. As always, massive thank you to my patrons. Many thank you for your support, and if you are in a position to do so, please do consider donating yourself. As always, thanks a lot, and until next time.